Please join me in welcome to the stage for a discussion about the ghost on screen. An author, he's the nation's favourite film critic. He has an unparalleled knowledge of genre movies. Please show your appreciation for Mr. Mark Kermode. I used to think that a ghost was something that had been there forever, and that our idea, that ghosts had just been around since time immemorial. And it wasn't until me and Andy were researching ghost stories that actually ghosts are about 150 years old as we understand them, and that they're completely bound up or at least it seems to me they're completely bound up in the world of photography and optics.
I think that it is really interesting that you've chosen to start this evening off by showing a film, and incidentally I said I did just jump there, really. So I thought, that's fine, it's all for fine. But that idea that photography and ghost stories are absolutely bound up is, firstly, it has its roots in the idea that people used to do spectral photography. You could capture a spirit on a celluloid image that you couldn't see with your eyes. And we were just talking upstairs about what's the first ever ghost on film. We were talking about whether you talk about Méliès's film because he has, superimpositions. In fact, probably the first ever ghost on film is the train arriving at a station. Because one of the interesting things about moving images was that very, very early on, as you probably all know, cinema comes out of circus sideshows. People have figured out how to do magic lantern shows, and these were involved in kind of conjuring tricks and making spectral images appear around rooms. And
Pepper's Ghost actually was the first ghost on stage, which was accomplished with a mirror, a kind of half silver mirror, which is where the notion of a transparent ghost comes from.
And of course, that whole idea that that cinema comes from a transparency with light passing through it, it does exactly have its roots in that. But when cinema first started, when there's this famous story about them showing the train arriving at a station in the 1890s, and the idea is that what happened was a bunch of people watched a black and white image of a train coming into the station. They all screamed, they all ran away from the screen, and the standard story is they ran away from the screen because they thought the train was coming towards them. Well, actually, when you look at reports about that first showing, people talk about phantasms. They talked about the phantasmagoric thing of just seeing a moving image, and very early on, people talked about cinema as doing something which was profoundly weird, which was capturing the moving image of people. And the first question people asked was, will the image still be there when they're dead? And people wanted to know immediately, those people who were standing on the train station, well, when they're dead, will that film still and that idea that you could reincarnate people through watching movies.
Isn't that brilliant? Because that's something we take for granted. We don't think twice about it. But just think, if you were confronted with that for the first time, you would have a moving record of somebody who was dead. You would literally be looking at what you would consider to be a ghost.
You would, and I think that's exactly why cinema was originally thought of as being something to do with black magic. I mean, there's a very sort of popular idea which actually lasted throughout the life of celluloid cinema, which is that celluloid cinema is tied up with magical spells. Kenneth Anger thought this, and I'm sorry, I've managed to get 3 minutes in without mentioning The Exorcist, so I'm going to do it. Billy Graham famously said that when The Exorcist was projected in the 1970s, that there was an evil lurking within the celluloid, and that somehow, if you put a beam of light through it, that would release that evil spirit. Well, that is tied right back to the birth of cinema, the idea that cinema is capturing something deathly, something otherworldly, something magical, and it is Carnival Sideshow. And from what you found from your research is that, oddly enough, that's pretty much the life of the popular ghost as we know it. Because you were saying, well, if you look at popular cinema, actually there's not as many ghost stories as you think there are.
But the other interesting thing is culturally, again, you think the ghost is a universal, everywhere, everyone has ghosts. This isn't the case. I just got back from Moscow. Ghost Stories has just opened in Moscow, and one of the first problems they had there adapting it was they don't have ghosts in Russia. Or if they do, they're not things that adults are scared of, because the Russians are so hard as a nation that they think that you're a sissy if you're scared of a ghost, as they would put it. So
I love the idea that that's because they're tough. It's got nothing to do with their...
Because there are, without giving anything away, there are other things in the play that are more tangible, and that they can understand. Yeah. But no, the ghost is a thing for children.
That whole thing about cultural differences, I think, will be apparent to anybody if you were watching ghost movies or horror movies in the last 20 years, and you saw what happened with the explosion of Japanese horror. I mean, obviously those, Kaineiga were around in Japan for ages, but suddenly we had them over here, and we had the extraordinary success of Ringu, and then Dark Water. And what was really interesting about those films was that those stories meant something different. It's really fascinating that when they take that story, in Japan, the idea of spirits and ghosts they're much more common. There'll be a spirit in a clock. When you have bodies of water, there's always spirits. People are much more in tune with that idea. And in the original Japanese story, the function of the ghost is not to be scary. It is to somehow reconcile some problem in the past. Now, when they transpose it to America, the problem is you can tell the same story, but the ghost means something different. And I don't want to spoil the end of this, but if you look at the Japanese version of Dark Water and the American version of Dark Water, although they stick narratively pretty close to each other, the endings are crucially different because the ghosts don't mean the same thing. And it is true that the whole way in which we perceive ghosts as scary or creepy and all the things that we think of as classically scary ghost stories, they are very culturally specific.
And it's funny how many of these ghosts have roots in literature. It was first and foremost a literary form, an English form. Really, Dickens was there first, probably with Christmas Carol in terms of popularising it, and his other ghost stories, and then and others, and then Sheridan Le Fanu, the Irish writer. And there was a development over about 50 years, which led to the likes of Shirley Jackson, who wrote the novel
Haunting of Hill House.
And what's interesting when you follow this journey is it starts off, ghosts are very literal, and rather like the spiritualists that were taking photographs of ghosts in the early years of photography, they were real things. By the time you get to Shirley Jackson, they've become fully realised as metaphors, and they're ways of writing about psychology and what's going on inside people.
There is the most brilliantly creepy scene in Ghost Story, which I'm going to spoil for everyone now if you haven't read it. There's a central character who's either Eva or Alma, depending on which part of the story you're in, and the central male character, who is having an affair with her, wakes up in the middle of the night and he sees her looking out of a window, and she says something. And the first time we visit this event, he thinks that what she says is, "I saw a ghost." Later on in the book, he realises that he remembered it wrongly, that she didn't say, "I saw a ghost." What she said was, "I am a ghost." Even later on in the story, he realises that that wasn't what she said either. What she actually said was, "You are a ghost." And it's the most brilliant crystallisation of that idea of what happened to the ghost story, exactly as you described it. It went from being something external to being something completely internal. And the punchline of so many of those post-Shirley Jackson stories is, "You are a ghost." From what you've done, from your writing, how would you, what do you say the parameters are that this defines it as a ghost?
I did do a few years ago, almost as a technical exercise to please myself, I listed all my favourite ghost stories, and I looked for all the intersections and what the features in common were.
And
sin was the big one, a sin in the past, a certain kind of wrongness, and this is a very subtle thing to describe. It's there in The Rocking Horse Winner, which is a D.H. Lawrence short story. It's a singular strangeness, an original detail that you haven't encountered before, that makes these films so memorable. For example,
it's about uncanny.
It's the uncanny, which literally means the thing that you do not know. It's that, and what about all these techniques is they're all plugging into our deepest, oldest psychology, because all this stuff is in the oldest part of the brain. It's called the amygdala. It's like our reptile bit in the brain that controls our fear response. And there's an American academic called Jordan Peterson, Canadian academic Jordan Peterson, who's written a terrific book called Maps of Meaning, and he maintains that this is at the essence of why we're human, the fact that our first response to everything is fear. And so there's something about the ghost story that absolutely gets down to the essence of who we are as creatures.
Well, of course, it's significant that Lovecraft says that the oldest emotion is fear, and that's why actually horror literature should be seen as more important than anybody else, because it taps right into our most basic experiences. All the stories that you cite, they all have that sense of sadness, of melancholia, of loss. And actually, when you're talking about them as being terrifying, and they all got scary moments. I mean, the film that we just saw had a big jump at the end of it. But actually, the reason that those films, I think, work, whether it's The Shining, or whether it's The Haunting, or whether it's actually particularly The Changeling, which is a real tragedy story, that there is mingled with that guilt and fear are sisters, as Jackson famously said, but it's that sense of loss, it's that sense of mourning that's underpinning it.
Which is an essential part of being human, because we're all embedded in it and there's no escape from it, and that's one of the things that a ghost story allows you to look at and maybe just come to terms with that little. Maybe that's why they're another reason they're so fascinating.